The primary meta. Many people know what is considered to be the best frames of a weapon type, but not many people really know how those weapon types compare to each other. That's what we're going to be covering here today. We're going to be breaking down every primary weapon frame and comparing them to each other and really see how they compete within their optimal ranges. If you'd like to know more on a particular weapon type, we've covered all of them in the channel, so you can find the specifics there. Right, let's get into it. We're going to start from the longest range to the lowest. First up, a quick rundown of what the numbers here mean, so everyone understands what they're looking at. Raw crit is if never needing to reload and firing at a full fire rate and never missing a crit shot. The value is taken over a theoretical minute, so a potential output, not taking into consideration the average mag size or the base reload speed. So DPS of during firing alone. DPS crit is the value of the base crit damage over 1 minute, taking into account the average reload speed and magazine size. So it's important to think about having to reload and moving to multiple targets and only ever landing crits. DPS average is taking the value of 1 body shot and 1 crit shot. So base damage and crit multiplier combined to see how they perform in real world scenarios where crit shots are not always available for some situations. The top 3 of each category will be in yellow and the new additions will be in green. Now that we know that, let's begin. 99 meters and above. Only 2 weapon frames really work in this area, and that is the bows. Both are really strong, and if really good at aiming with them at a distance, they pull some really heavy damage. Lightweights take the top spot here. Slightly faster draw time really helps. So, some people are not really that much of a fan of this frame, but I blame the sound, as they don't really feel like they hit that hard. But the numbers do not lie. Bows are going to look terrible on raw damage going forward, due to the incredibly short reload time, so it doesn't really impact their stats a great deal, compared to other weapons anyway. So would recommend looking at the DPS values if wanting to compare them further in the video. 87 meters. Introducing the 150 scouts. Pretty much a primary sniper when looking at the range of these. They do take the top spot for damage output in raw crit, but if being realistic, reload is kind of part of what these things really need to do, and once that data comes into consideration, it falls up to 14% behind on damage output. But if trying to tackle enemies at this range, scopes are really going to help out greatly. So for consistency, 150 scouts could be a really good option here. 74 meters brings in the 180 scouts. It holds a similar role as the 150 scouts, but with a 13 meters shorter base range than the 150s. But it does outpace the 150s in all areas, taking the top spot for the raw damage output and around about 6.5% behind the bow damage output in the DPS values. Personally, I'm more likely to go for the 180s for longer ranges, as I prefer the cadence of the shots, and there are a good selection of weapons in this frame. These can be a really good option to switch to when attempting to help out your teammates on the other side of the bridge during the bridge encounter on Crota's End Raid. 69 meters, bringing in the 200s and the 120 scouts. Both of these options are really disappointing, in terms of damage anyway. 200s you'd think at least managed to take away the top spot for raw output from the 180s, but that's just not the case. On DPS, 200s are between 4 and 7% lower than the 180s. 120 scouts are really poor with outputs. They suffer greatly with their dual loading, as drags out their loading for a really long time. But even the raw damage which negates this detail, they're still 12% behind the 180s. I really hope Bungie take a look over these 2 frames and help them, as currently they're almost pointless running in PVE, as there are longer range scouts outperforming them by a significant amount. 66 meters. In comes the fastest of the scouts, the 260s. These are pretty popular in PvE as scouts are considered, and here we can see why. They take the top spot of raw output by over 10% and are rubbing shoulders with the lightweight bows by being within 4% of both the DPS stats. A very impressive performance from them, but can be tricky to keep the crosshair on target at over 60 meters. So tap firing might be preferred over just leaning on the trigger, but remember, these stats are under the understanding that these weapons are being fired at full fire rate. 39 meters. Yes, there's a huge drop in range here. There is nothing with a base range between 39 and 66 meters. Here we see pulse rifles getting into the mix, 340s and 450 aggressive pulses. And surprisingly, neither of these threaten the damage values of any of the top slots from the longer ranges, getting outperformed by all the scouts and bows in all areas which matter, apart from the 120 scouts which sit at right at the very bottom. This will be a trend for that frame. There is no real redeeming qualities for these weapons frames, unfortunately, so hopefully they get looked at someday to make them competitive within their range bracket. 36 meters. In comes the BXR Pulse frame. This one got missed in my Pulse Rifles video as presumed it to be a lightweight frame with highly improved hipfire accuracy, but when I was asked about it in the comments section, I double checked it to find out this frame actually has its own unique damage profile as well, and here is where it lands. 3rd highest in terms of DPS crit, 4th in terms of DPS average. So not a bad performance, but it's still behind the 260 scouts and lightweight bows, but not terrible, especially for a pulse rifle. 34 meters. In comes the 390 pulse rifles, and the first are the hand cannons. 390 pulses, similar to most of the pulse family, really lacking, only marginally better than the 340s. Pulse rifles are really not doing great in this current state of the sandbox. Now let's talk about hand cannons, especially 120s right now. Wow, what a huge leap they have received this season. Not only did they get a massive damage improvement in PVE, but the lower stat reload speeds got a really healthy buff. 120 hand cannons really suffered with this prior to the update, having an awful reload speed. It felt like you could go and complete all your house chores in time it took them to reload. Now it's much more reasonable. 120s benefited from this so much it has shot all the way to the top for all the listed values. DPS values, it's squeezed in with just a 1% lead, and raw damage it stomps 17% lead over the 260 scouts, which is crazy when you think about where they were last season. 33 meters. 450 lightweight pulses and 360 auto rifles enter at this range. Lightweight pulses, just like all the others, really poor performance here, grouping up with the other pulses in the bottom half of the pile. 360 autos on the other hand, storm straight to the top by 5% over the 120 hand cannons. But hand cannons managed to hold tight to the top spot on the raw output. But this is something to consider, as 33 meters is a considerable distance for an auto, and beats out all of the pulses and scouts so far in terms of its damage. So many people are potentially sleeping on them for higher end activities. So it's worth checking the roll that you get next time before sharding it. 32 meters. 540 pulses and the newly returning heavy burst hand cannon. 540 pulse rifle, you guessed it, entering in at the bottom half of the stack, alongside its fellow pulse rifles. A shame really, as there's a number of 540s that have promising perk pools, but the damage is just not there in comparison to other weapons in the same range bracket. Let's talk heavy burst hand cannons. On paper, this thing is a monster, and its damage values have really shown its potential. But myself have spent a significant amount of time with the Warden's Law, trying to get its recoil under control, to consistently land headshots. And it's possibly the hardest weapon in the game to wrestle with to get it to behave the way that you really want it to, at the ranges it should really be able to hit consistently. This is a guess from myself, but more experienced FPS players out there will understand what I mean, but it feels like the bloom is really aggressive per round on this weapon. So from the initial trigger pull, the first round of the burst lands consistently, but then feels like the bloom is way too big for the second round of the burst, making the second shot not consistently land near the first, making it feel pretty bad during fluid movement. And that was with a Warden's Law with 62 stability. So keep this in mind when seeing the results here. Personally, I would gravitate more towards the DPS average on this weapon due to its unpredictable behavior when trying to land all headshots. 29 meters. These upcoming ranges are where most PvE engagements are going to be, within normal gameplay. In comes the 450 auto rifles, and the poster child for Destiny, the 140 hand cannon. 450 auto rifles jump straight to the podium, taking second place for DPS average and third spot for the DPS crit value. Fourth spot on the raw crit though, so it does slip a little bit in this area, but it's a really respectable performance for a frame that doesn't really get much use. Almost all 450s have really powerful perk pulls, so if you get an interesting roll, give it a spin. As for the 140 hand cannons, finally back to take its crown. at the top of the DPS values at 29 meters. It is second on the raw crit list, only to the heavy burst hand cannons, but I've said my piece on those. 140s are an amazing frame, very easy to land consecutive headshots with them. They are a favourite within the Destiny community for a reason. 27 meters. In comes the 180 hand cannon. Another very popular hand cannon frame, and one I was potentially very interested in seeing where it would end up after the buffs, as this was the best performing hand cannon last season. And to no surprise to myself, it takes the top spot of both DPS stats by nearly 8.5%, and only 2.5% behind the unwieldy heavy burst in terms of raw crit performance, along with a recoil pattern that is much easier to land shots that you're going for. Truly an amazing weapon frame for PvE. 26 meters. Introducing the 600 auto rifles. Maybe surprising to some, but the 600s, although feel great, they actually get outperformed and outranged by the 450s, and only narrowly beat out the 360s. It's not really worth investing any time into right now, especially if you have a 450 with a similar perk combination. 23 meters. Rounding out the auto rifle family, here comes the 720 auto rifle frame. Beating out the 140 hand cannons at second place for DPS stats, not quite able to dethrone the 180 hand cannons though, and cannot quite reach the raw crit damage the hand cannons can, so it has to settle for fourth here. But it's a good bullet hose if needing a rapid fire weapon at this range. 19 meters. Now we're reaching submachine gun territory. Let's see how they hold up. First, the 600 SMGs. A top 4 for DPS average, actually managed third for raw crit, but 6th in terms of DPS crit, so a relatively slow reload speed is letting it down here. But if we're directly thinking of having a rapid firing weapon at this range, 720 autos are more consistent. So if not needing an SMG for artifact reasons, the 720 autos might yield a better result here. 18 meters. Now for the 720 SMGs. These frames actually perform worse than 600 SMGs in terms of DPS value, only managing to get a win over the 600s in raw crit. So is currently in a weird spot, not being able to outperform its longer reaching slower firing alternative. Again, would say it might be worth looking at the 720 auto depending on the role for better results. 17 meters. Here comes the 900 adaptive SMGs, the strongest performing so far of the SMGs, 4th place on the DPS average and crit, even managing to grab the 3rd spot for raw crit damage. Really impressive performance compared to the other SMGs so far. But there are not really a large selection of these in the game right now, especially any with really appetizing perk pools. But solid base performance. 16 meters. Now we're in Sidearm territory. This is where it's going to get wild. But first, 900 lightweight SMGs. These SMGs are in the middle of the pack in terms of SMG DPS values, but their raw performance is one of the best, taken second overall at this range. This raw value really made them stand out and feel strong during use. But as the DPS value is pretty low, it's common for them to feel pretty weak when trying to jump from one target to another, or against higher tier content, as having to constantly need to reload to take on multiple targets, its low DPS values really show where they fall down in strength here. So let's look at the other family of frames in this range, Sidearms. At 16 meters we are getting the 260s, the 300s and the 325s. 260s are fine. They manage to perform well in raw output, but fall down in DPS values when reloading is needed to be accounted for. The 325s got a nerf this season. They were nothing special in PvE last season, so sounds like a nerf to deal with something within PvP. But they're still managing to hold second place for DPS, but slip way down the pack when it comes to raw output. Then we have 300s. This frame absolutely tears through all the competition with its stats. Highest DPS stat in both slots by nearly 12%, and even beats out all the SMGs in terms of raw output. I can confirm how powerful they are from personal experience. In the Crota's M Master Raid, where it's just a flood of enemies at all times, having a Buzzard, Drang or Keening on hand, it makes light work of everything running at you. 15 meters, our final range category, brings with it the rest of the sidearms. 491s, 450s and 360s. None of which are able to knock the 300s off the top spot for DPS average, but the 450s and the 941s come mighty close. As for DPS crit, 491 snatched the top spot by about 1/4%. As for raw output though, 360s take this spot, but not by much. Only 2% separate all the top 3 here. Sidearms truly lock out the top spots across the board here. 260 sidearms are the only poor performers in terms of sidearms. There's not really much separating the others. Okay, that was a lot to go through. Real quick before we continue with what we're going to do with this information, a tiny request from myself. If you enjoyed the video so far or learned something, a like on the video really helps it in the algorithm and would be massively appreciated. Anyway, back on topic. So how am I going to interpret this? Personally, I'm obviously going to break this down in the ranges. So if you're looking for a primary that is greater at longer ranges, let's take 34 meters and above as an example. Depending on the situation, either bows or scouts are definitely the play. If knowing I'm going to be interrupted up close, we'll likely pick a bow, as it's easy to dispatch enemies with a bow via hipfire. But if I can scope in, knowing I'm going to be able to take ranged shots without any interference, 180s or 260 scouts are by far the play. And I think this would work for me from 34 meters upwards. Okay, let's look at some examples. Kinetic options, we got Whistler's Whim from Trials. Having the unique option to drop with kill clip, and also Thresh in the third column, makes this a personal favourite of mine. Servant Leader from Gambit, a fantastic scout, that has the option to get one for all, to really lay down some damage even at range. Hung Jury SR4, Nightfall and Vanguard. Awesome at really long ranges, and able to get kinetic tremors. An interesting perk that adds AoE, but it's getting slightly reworked by Bungie in the future according to communications. Fingers crossed it triggers faster on the slower firing weapons. Stasis options, the Raconteur, which is a craftable from Season 20. A craftable bow with headstone. Really good if you're building into stasis, and always a very strong option. Jararaka 3SR, which is a world drop. I never used to think too much about Vice Scouts until more recently. After trying them out, I was pleasantly surprised. This one can get a choice of Focus Fury, Headstone, Kill Clip, Golden Tricorn, so a lot of options here. As for Strand, we don't have a bow yet. Maybe in Season 23 we'll get one, but we do have a few scout rifles. Fang of Ear from Crota's End. So really nice stats on this one. Can also come with a big selection of really nice perks. Golden Tricorn, Kill Clip, Hatchling, Sword Logic, even Precision Instrument to choose from. Let's look at arc options. Tripwire Canary, craftable from Season 19. An awesome arc bow that could be crafted to your liking. Point of the Stag. I've been trying for so long to get my hands on an Archer's Tempo and Golden Tricorn roll, and still haven't managed it yet. I've reset with Saladin 3 times when the point became available, and still not got it yet. One day, hopefully. Contingency Plan? Again, another Vice Scout. This one has the option to get one for all, so I'm a big fan. Solar options? Tyranny of Heaven from Last Wish. A great bow, and can be crafted with Dragonfly in the left column, and one for all in the right. So one headshot kill has the potential to grant 35% extra damage, which is huge when you get it rolling. For a scout, Trustee from the Deepstone Crypt. Not the biggest fan of this scope, but it's always performed well, and with reconstruction, reloading is never needed. Void options? Under Your Skin from Season 16, which is a craftable. No massively crazy perks on this one, but it can get Archer's Tempo and Successful Warm-Up together, which makes it a really solid bow. As for a scout, we have Doom Chelchus, which is from Kingsfall. By now, people can recognise my love for stats for all and one for all, and it's here on the Chelchus, so a personal pick of mine. Right, let's start to get a little closer on the ranges. So, the 35 to 30 meter pocket is a really tough one, but looking at the stats, I always try to go for something that has a balance between raw and DPS crit. 360 autos have a great DPS value, but really lack in raw. The burstfire hand cannon does great here on paper, but is really inconsistent, especially at longer ranges. So we'll likely go with the newly buffed 120 hand cannons, if not falling back onto a bow, which I never thought I'd ever say. In the kinetic slot, for kinetic options we have Pure Poetry from the Vanguard, a large perk pool to select from, but personally I've kept one with Steady Hands and Frenzy, so very nice and snappy feeling hand cannon. Stasis options, something new from the Dawning event. I have 2 of these which I really need to play with more. I have one with Stats for All and Headstone, and yes, the Stasis Shard Shatter procs the Stats for All perk. And another one with Rapid Hit and Golden Tricorn. That one I really need to test out. Strand options, we have Round Robin from Neomuna. The only one right now, but it has Nano Tracer rockets, which are actually pretty nice. And with options like Golden Tricorn, Kill Clip, Hatchling as options, it's a pretty nice hand cannon. Let's look at arc options. I'm not likely to go for a 120 hand cannon for arc, as there is no really viable options for PvE. Combined action is here, but its perk pool doesn't really lend itself to be strong in PvE. so would prefer to likely pick one of the prior mentioned longer range arc weapons instead. Solar options. We have Igneous Hammer from Trials, one of the best 120s in the game, and has the option to get rapid hit and Golden Tricorn, which I'm really enjoying. Void options. We have Targeted Redaction, a craftable from Season 21. I've been really enjoying using destabilizing rounds on this one with Outlaw. Okay, let's look at a little bit closer ranges. 29 meters to 17 meters. No need to think twice here. Hand cannons, especially 180s. Since they're buffed, they absolutely dominate in this range group. And this is the main ranges I tend to engage in weapon combat with enemies. So for kinetic options, we have the Survivor's Epitaph from Crucible. With its additional 10% from being a kinetic and options for one for all, this weapon can put out some serious damage. Stasis options. There are no readily available Stasis 180s right now, so we'd personally lean towards the IS Luna, which is a 140 from Grasp of Avarice. This is one of the best feeling hand cannons in the game. Strand options. No 180s here yet, so again having to fall back to a 140, and Kept Confidence, which is a craftable from Season 22. At first I wasn't really interested in this hand cannon, but after crafting it and leaning into the collective action perk, it's actually really nice. Arc options. Posterity from the Deep Stone Crypt. Craftable, with the third column having options between Reconstruction, Rapid Hit and Vault Shot, and the fourth column having the options between Frenzy, Focus Fury and Rampage. There's a combination for every taste here. Solar options. Frontier's Cry from Iron Banner. Yet again, another weapon that can get stats for all and one for all. You just gotta get lucky on it dropping for you. Void options. We have Word of Crota from Crota's End, with options like the third column getting Demolitionist and Light in Action, Repulsor Brace, Dragonfly, and everything in the fourth column is desirable. In my opinion, it's one of the best hand cannons in the game. Okay, now we're getting super up close. So this is 16 meters to point blank. Sidearms. No question. Sidearms have been amazing in closer environments. And if I want to push into a group of enemies, there's no better weapon for that. The crazy output these things can give when within range is game changing. Ever since doing the sidearm video last season, I have not looked back. Sidearms are by far one of the most powerful weapons in the game, as long as you can get close enough to use them. Kinetic options. We have the Buzzard, which is a Nightfall weapon and can be acquired from the Vanguard, with it getting a 10% bonus to damage, and options like Frenzy, Kinetic Tremors, Swashbuckler. It's a really solid pick. Stasis options. We have the Sununa SI6, which is a world drop. This one can come with Feeding Frenzy and Golden Tricorn, and if you proc Golden Tricorn ×2, this thing will tear holes in things. Strand options. Mikhail's Reverence from Root of Nightmares. Probably the weirdest looking sidearm, but this sidearm puts in some serious work. Arc options. We have a choice of the Keening or this one here, the Vision, which is a world drop. It's a 3 burst with the ability to get one for all. Will surprise many people how quickly this thing can put even stronger opponents down. Solar. Drang, which is a craftable from Season 17. Without question, one of the strongest sidearms in Destiny history. Void. Theo Retura 59. A world drop. Not very many Void sidearms right now, and this gets Threat Detector, and either Swashbuckler or Golden Tricorn, so it's a really solid option. This is part of the weapon series which I'm producing, covering all of the weapon frames within the game. We've already covered primaries and specials, and the heavy weapons series is coming soon, so if you want to catch those when they drop, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out. Also, a like would be massively appreciated to be able to help the channel. So what does everyone else think of the results? Anything here surprise you? Let me know in the comment section below. I'm active in the comment section, so happy to chat with everyone in there. As always, thank you for watching, be safe, and never let your tea go cold.